adults. This is our Hope Pack Bible recap. And so I will be recapping what we talked about in this week's Bible study. We're still in Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 8. I will not read them in its entirety on this recap because you can go back and read it for yourself. But we started out kind of reviewing where we left off, and we talked about we had already talked about verses 4 through 6 in prior Bible studies, and I wanted to recap that before we started verse 7, which is our focus in this week's Bible study. And so we talked about how in verse 4 it starts out talking about we ought to rejoice in the Lord in the midst of our troubles, our trials, our tribulations, in the midst of storms. And we do that by not putting our focus on what we're dealing with, but our focus is on God. And so when our focus is on God, our response is rejoicing in the Lord when our focus is on Him. Because of our focus on Him, we can rejoice in the midst of all that we're going through. And then in verse 5, it talks about our gentleness being made known to all. And so in with that verse, we kind of focused on that in the midst of our storm, although we're going through, we have to be mindful of our attitude towards others. And sometimes we may be cranky, we may be a little short with people because we're dealing with our own frustrations. But in this verse, we were talking about how we should always be mindful of our response to others, because we want our gentleness to be made known to all. And people are watching us as we deal with our trials and our tribulations. And so we just need to be mindful that our response to others is always one of kindness and gentleness. And then in verse 6, we talked about what our primary call is in the midst of anxiety, and that primary call being that we are called to pray. And so in that time of prayer study, we also talked about prayer being our communication, our approach to God. It's our general devotion to God. It's our worship and adoration to God. All these things that prayer can be. We talked about our petitions to God being one of humility, and that also our prayer should be coupled with an attitude of thanksgiving, and how that thanksgiving should exude from our heart, and be a place of thanksgiving towards God. And we also talked about our requests being specific, not because God doesn't know what we need, but really as a point of reference for ourselves, so that we know that we specifically prayed about something, and we can kind of go back and pinpoint, yeah, I prayed specifically for that, and I know that it was God because I prayed for that. Not because God needs us to tell Him what our needs are, because He already knows, but it's for our own point of reference, and it's for also to help us relieve the burden and the weight off of us, and to give it all to God, and be specific about it, be honest about it, tell Him how you feel. And so that's kind of where we were in verses 4 through 6. And so now in verse 7, where it talks about the peace of God guarding our heart. And so our focus was that scripture, but we kind of left that scripture to kind of build upon Philippians 4:7, and we went over to Acts 27. That's Acts 27 verses 13 through 44. And it's in those scriptures that we talked about what being in the midst of a storm can do to us. We talked about verse 15, 16, 17, and 19, specifically things that arise in us in the midst of a storm. In verse 15, we talked about the overwhelmment that we may feel in a storm. A storm may come and overwhelm us. In verse 17, we talked about being afraid. And then in verse 18, we talked about the panic that arises in a storm. We looked at how the people on the ship in the midst of the storm, because of their panic and fear, they just begin to throw stuff off of the ship, and sometimes in the midst of panic, in order to make us feel better and have a sense of finding some resolution, we just begin to do stuff, not really being prayerful about it, but we just begin to act because of what we're feeling from that panic and that fear. And so we talked about them throwing stuff over in the midst of frustration and panic. And then we also talked about the hopelessness that we sometimes feel in the midst of a storm. And so those are some of the human things that we all deal with when we're in the midst of the storm, um, and how um, we have to get those things in check when we're in the midst of a storm. But the one verse that I wanted us to focus in on was the verse 21, and a lot of you guys was a little mad with Paul because of this verse. And that verse, go and read it. I'm not going to read it for you, but go and read it. But y'all were saying things like Paul was throwing salt in the wounds, and he was kicking a man while he was down. But I gave you a different perspective, and I said that sometimes we have to take ownership for when we're out of line, when we're disobedient with God. I have to understand that sometimes the storm that we're currently in is our own fault. It's our own doing. We did it to ourselves because of our disobedience. We know that it was not in the will of God, and so we went on and did it anyway. But check out verse 21. But within verse 21, I also talked about how 21, 23, well, no, 23, verse 23, we also talked about how there were promises that were given in verse 23. And we looked at those three promises in verse 23. And in those verses, Paul talked about an experience that he had, and where God gave him peace about what they were dealing with in this storm. And so in verse 23, we learned that we are not alone in the midst of a storm. God sent an angel to Paul in the midst of the storm to allow him to know that God was with him, and that God provided comfort, and not only comfort, but proclamation that there would be victory coming out of the storm. And so we have to remember that we are not alone in the midst of a storm. We also have to remember that we belong to God. That was also something that was in verse 23. We belong to God, and that we are also servants of God. And because we belong to God and we serve God, that God will do everything necessary to make sure that we go through the storm according to his will. And so there were some other things that we talked about that I can't really go into in this video, but I want you to look at those 3 points. Also in verses 35 and 36, we also talked about how in again, how we our attitude can cause someone else to be encouraged or discouraged. And so I talked about how the passengers on the ship had not eaten for 14 days, and for 14 days they had gone without food. And so Paul, after he had gotten this word of encouragement from the Lord and had given it to the other shipmates, he talked to them and said, hey, y'all should eat. You haven't eaten. But they did not do so. And so Paul, in faith, he went on and ate and gave thanks to the Lord. And in him doing that, that encouraged them to go ahead and eat. And so I just said that to say that people are watching what we do, and what we do in the midst of a storm can be encouragement and a blessing to others. And so right after that, they were encouraged and blessed. Again, there was this throwing off stuff on the boat, but this was different from the first time, because the first time it was because of panic. This throwing off was after they were encouraged. And so I looked at that, and I remind you guys that when we are encouraged, we think a little bit clearer. And so this throwing off was kind of like as when we go to God in prayer and we throw off the things that weigh us down. And so we talked about that a little bit, that we have to be mindful as we are encouraged and are going through the storm, that we still have to continue to put off things that can easily weigh us down and cause us to be back in a place of panic and overwhelmment. And so that's what we talked about a little bit there. And then lastly, we talked about verse 44 and how the ship was broken up in pieces. Those that could swim went on and swam the head ashore, but those who could not swim, they got to shore safely by holding on to broken pieces. And so I talked about how sometimes we come out of a storm, we may be broken and we may be in 1,000 pieces, but we still have to hold on to God in the midst of our broken pieces and allow God to drift us back to peaceful shores. And that takes time. That's a process. It may not happen overnight, but no matter how broken you are and in coming out of your storm, you still have to hold on to God. A lot of times it's easy for us to retreat when we're going through what we're going through and we feel broken. But I implore you to keep holding on to God and allow him to get you safely to a place where you're back to whole and feeling like yourself again and encouraged in spirit. And so lastly, I left you guys with two scriptures that I wanted you to go and look at. And I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to note it again. That was John 16:33 and Isaiah 43:2. And so it was a lot in this lesson. And so this video is a little longer than my normal videos, but I tried to give you everything that we had in our Bible study. And I pray that these notes are a blessing to you and will encourage you to go back and read that whole chapter of Acts 27 and see what the Lord speaks to you in your time of study. Until next time, I hope you enjoy this Hope Pack Bible recap. And y'all be blessed until our next Bible study. See you later. Deuces.